Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Suzanne Gilmore. I'll be your presenter today. I am one of 4 emergency response specialists for CWS Church World Service. Our webinar training today will cover long-term recovery basics, part 1 and 2. The total training time will be approximately 90 minutes. We will have a 15-minute break between part 1 and 2 and also take breaks to answer your questions. Please write your questions to the right in the question box. Who we are and what we do. CWS is a global organization working around the world, not just in the U.S. In 1946 to 1947, U.S. churches opened their hearts and provided more than 11 million pounds of food, clothing, and medical supplies to war-torn Europe and Asia in the aftermath of World War II. It was in the 1970s that CWS first began responding to U.S. disasters at the request of its member churches. I will introduce our member churches further into this presentation to you. We have 4 emergency response specialists covering all of the U.S. and its territories. We can provide material goods during the initial relief phase of a disaster, such as cleanup buckets, blankets, hygiene kits, baby kits, and school kits. For the long-term recovery phase, we are available to provide on-site training to long-term recovery groups and also support their effort with seed grants. Please don't hesitate to contact any one of us for more information. It is important to point out that all of our assistance is free of charge, while solely supported by our member denominations. More recently, CWS was one of the founding members of a global partnership of faith-based humanitarian agencies known as the ACT Alliance, with members in 140 countries. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our CWS staff. This is Barry Shade. He is also a presenter and on this webinar today. He oversees our domestic emergency response program. His contact information is provided here. This information will also be posted after part 2 of our presentation today if you don't get all the information right now. Joanne Hale, her region includes much of the Northeast and one sunny state, Florida. The regional map with each representative ERS will be shown after I introduce each. Sandra Kennedy Owes, her region is much of the southern states. Also on our webinar today as a presenter is my colleague Kule Fan, with the beautiful Pacific Ocean behind her. Kule is located in Hawaii and covers the nation's Pacific Northwest and also Alaska. Here is my information, and I'm located in Kansas with responsibilities for the Midwest. Please take a quick look at our regional map. Take a moment to see where you are and which emergency response specialist represents your state. Joanne Hale states are in green, Sandra Kennedy Owes red, Kule's are gold, and my territory is marked in blue. I will give you more time to take down the contact information later on. We will also have, as I mentioned, a 15-minute break. I will also try to speak in plain English and avoid acronyms as much as possible. Should I have a slip-up, please call me out and I will explain. If you haven't already, please follow us on Facebook. Our Facebook page includes information on long-term recovery webinars, workshops, and much more. You can find it under the name Church World Service U.S. Disaster Assistance. This page allows us to keep in touch with our friends across the U.S. Be a part of our network, and you can stay updated on what is going on in your area. Okay, let's get started. I will be starting off with a brief definition of a long-term recovery group and what it does for your community. I will also be covering terms that are commonly used in the long-term recovery process. I will then go over phases of disaster. From there, I will be talking about hazards and vulnerable populations and what circumstances can create a disaster in a community. Today I will discuss how to determine the type of long-term recovery group that might be best for your community. From there, I will inform you where to gather much needed information to start your LTRG. I will refer to the long-term recovery group as LTRG throughout this presentation. Throughout every phase of recovery, there will be issues that can make it difficult for the community to get back on track. I will share with you some common problems that have been seen in communities around the country and how they can inhibit recovery. We will wrap up Part 1 today by sharing best practices and guidelines on how to choose good leadership for your group. At the very end of this presentation, I will also be showing a few slides with a list of resources that you can call upon to help as you start your long-term recovery process. Without any further ado, let's get started. In Part 1 of our webinar, we will cover what long-term recovery means, some of the terminology as you may have to learn a whole different language in the process, hazards and vulnerability, some recovery issues you will probably encounter and need to be aware of, leadership necessary for a successful long-term recovery group, and the faith-based community and their assets to aid the long-term recovery of a community. Recovery, especially long-term recovery, is the longest and in many ways the hardest and most emotionally trying of these phases. Long-term recovery gets the least attention from the media and the general public. Often when the cameras have left, this is when long-term recovery starts. I'm sure that all of us have experienced in one way or another a person saying, "The disaster is over," when we haven't even begun to rebuild people's houses and lives. Today we'll be giving most our attention to that part of a disaster, the long-term recovery. As we move throughout this presentation today and tomorrow, we want to be sure we use a common understanding of what we mean when we use the term long-term recovery. What is it? Long-term recovery following a disaster is the process by which a community comes together to find and use the resources of survivors, the community, government programs, and the assistance of other partners to address the needs of affected individuals and families, focusing especially on the most vulnerable, so they may sustain their physical, social, economic, and spiritual well-being. This is the definition of a long-term recovery group, or commonly known LTRG. There are other names for long-term recovery groups. I have heard the terms coalition or committee. Many towns will use different terms interchangeably. Whatever you decide to call your long-term recovery group, the goal is the same. It is to help those with the most need. Long-term recovery groups can form as early as during the initial response phase or later, depending on the disaster. A LTRG has the potential to bring together organizations that would not work together otherwise. An LTRG can help to find available resources for individual households with unmet needs. History shows that after every disaster, some individuals and/or families may have unmet needs after a federal assessment, and this is where an LTRG can step in. It is very important for each long-term recovery group, long-term recovery component, to work together to reach the goal of reaching a new normal for your community. A well-organized group will deliver the community towards its long-term recovery goals. Because every disaster is unique, it is also important to take the information presented today and use it as a guide to help steer your LTRG in the right direction. While this will be a very broad overview, we understand that there will be some points that you would like to see explained in further detail. Our team is always available for LTRG training and consultation in our assigned regions if you need help organizing your group or simply if you have questions. We have been conducting training sessions in the Northeast throughout this year, particularly New Jersey and New York, as well as West Virginia, in response to Superstorm Sandy. There will be many components that will need to be managed as the community starts to rebuild. A LTRG can help find resources for unmet needs in the community and help agencies collaborate and work together effectively. A LTRG can designate volunteers and workers to make sure precious resources are distributed to those in need. As you can see, this is a list of possible components of an LTRG. All LTRGs may not have every component listed here. Each role is determined by the size and scope of the disaster and how many people were affected. While some LTRGs may be large and have very formal meetings, others may be small with a few local, state, and/or national groups that meet casually. Using this as a guide, it is important to develop a system that works for the community using all of these subgroups. Here are 4 examples of possible long-term recovery groups. All of these work. Which one is appropriate and best for your community and the people you serve has to be decided by the group. Unmet Needs Committee, no disaster-related organization, agencies communicate what they are doing. Long-Term Recovery Committee, minimum organization relies on the other agencies to do the work. Or Long-Term Recovery Organization handles all of the long-term recovery functions. Community Coalition for Recovery. That's usually a collaborative effort for LTR. I will now briefly review the stages of a disaster. At the top of this diagram is phase 1, the warning anticipation phase. It begins with the first advisory that a disaster will occur. It continues until the actual disaster hits or if the danger is over and the warning is called off. Phase 2 is when the disaster physically affected the community. Rescue work is underway. Police and other authority figures are sought after for guidance and help. Search and rescue is going on at this time. Agencies such as the Red Cross, Salvation Army, and Southern Baptist, for example, and many others, open shelters to house and feed survivors. During phase 3, the immediate emergency has passed. Unsolicited, spontaneous volunteers who are eager to help begin to arrive on the scene. Assessments of property damage and loss are initiated. Agencies and organizations begin to communicate with one another and situation reports are issued. Initial meetings may be organized to share information. In the fourth phase, the community tends to its medical and survival needs. Those displaced by the disaster seek temporary housing. The goal is to provide disaster survivors with safe, sanitary, secure, and functional housing. Phase 5. Rescue and relief continues while the community is coming together to help one another. For example, food, clothing, emergency medical care, and cleanup supplies are being distributed to those in need. Donations will be delivered to the most visible relief agencies. People will be desperately trying either to gain access to their homes or relieve the damaged area. In the absence of facts, exaggerations about loss of life may be abound. People motivated by greed will often find ways to exploit vulnerable people, and looting may take place. In the sixth and final phase, long-term reconstruction takes place. Rebuilding of infrastructure is underway. Mental health and spiritual care are offered for survivors and relief workers. There is a gradual adjustment for those impacted by the disaster. Local and regional organizations work together to rebuild the community. Non-profit agencies, community organizations, faith-based organizations, and ministerial alliances will organize and collaborate. Faith-based disaster response agencies advocate for the vulnerable populations, especially with regard to social justice and development concerns. These are the phases of the disaster, and in most cases, each phase is not clear and distinct. Many will overlap throughout the process. Being aware that we have different levels of disaster-related knowledge in our audience today, I will be covering disaster terms that are important to understand. These terms will be used throughout this presentation, and I will briefly define each. Disaster: an event that causes human suffering or creates needs that survivors cannot alleviate without spiritual, monetary, material, and/or physical assistance. Emergency: a sudden, generally unexpected occurrence or set of circumstances that demands immediate attention. Hazard: human or natural event or force that represents a threat to vulnerable people. Vulnerability: the measure of cultural, social, economic, and environmental factors and unsafe conditions that put people at risk of a disaster. Natural disaster: natural disasters largely involve geological and climatic hazards. This is a photo of the tornado that devastated Moore, Oklahoma just recently. Technologically caused or man-made disasters: caused by the application or misapplication of human technology. Perfect example, seen here in the picture, West Texas. Emergency management: a comprehensive emergency or disaster management system requires the cooperation efforts of individuals, the private sector, government at all levels, community-based organizations, and faith-based organizations. The intersection of hazards and people in harm's way equates to a disaster. A floodplain without people, animals, or property would not experience a disaster because there is no threat to life. The same is true about a tornado in our open plains. This is the devastation that was left after Superstorm Sandy. Thanks to the effort of many organizations, both private, nonprofit, and faith-based, as well as governmental agencies, neighborhoods are slowly starting to rebuild. Now let's take a look at hazards before we get into the details. Here is the definition. I let you look at the slide for a second. It is important to determine the hazards that are present in your community. I will be going over possible hazards that may affect your area. There can be dangerous locations in your area that may be susceptible to a disaster. Here are some examples, and I'm sure one or more may exist in your communities. Floodplains can be river and coastal, areas sensitive to earthquakes, volcanoes, toxic chemicals, transportation infrastructure. This photo shows you a levee surrounding a farmhouse in Yazoo City during the Mississippi flood in 2011. People living in buildings that are not safe. For example, an old home that may not be up to code or a mobile home are extremely vulnerable in a disaster. Or those without access to shelters, or for those who do not know the pre-established evacuation routes. Inadequate infrastructure is a major threat if not addressed properly. A tiny leak in a roof can become a hazard in heavy rains. Another example might be electrical wiring that is exposed to the elements. The building that you live in is a good place to start determining if there are potential hazards. So, what makes a population vulnerable in a disaster? And another important question, who are the most vulnerable in a disaster? Let's start with the circumstances that can make a population vulnerable. Every community has specific groups or persons that are at greater risk. Because of any number of circumstances, local economic systems can affect specific groups of a community, making them more at risk. High levels of unemployment and a depressed housing market can result in a cluster of the community being more affected by a disaster. Existing deficiencies in local institutions can affect certain populations. For example, limited fire response services and access to medical facilities. Those who have not had the opportunity to plan for their own needs. For example, members of the community that have little or no voice in the political process. It took the disaster response community until after Hurricane Katrina to realize that people with disabilities need to be part of the whole process of planning and preparedness. Communities who have not thought or acted on preparedness and mitigation. Lack of efforts make them especially vulnerable. In some cases, it may not be because they are deficient in any particular area. It can be because they are not prone to a certain type of disaster. For example, residents in Oklahoma may be focusing on preparing for floods or tornadoes, but do not prepare for earthquakes. In the past year, Oklahoma has seen some substantial earthquakes. It's a good idea to pay attention to trends in your state and/or region to be prepared for new potential hazards and risks. I give you an example. The Oklahoma City area, for example, experienced an earthquake in 2011. I personally live about 360 miles south of Oklahoma City and actually felt tremors in my house. It took me until the next morning watching the news to really comprehend what I had noticed the night before. We simply don't expect an earthquake in the plains, and we don't prepare for it. Poor communication resources are a threat that cannot always be helped in a situation. It usually depends on the size and scope of the disaster and what communication lines are down during and after a disaster. With little way to stay in touch, inadequate communication is a threat that can affect recovery both short and long term. Sometimes there is discrimination against some groups or neighborhoods in a community. It can be difficult for them to be treated fairly in the recovery process. Knowing where the hazards are and identifying the most vulnerable members of the community can help the recovery process. After discovering issues that affect recovery, you can now focus your attention toward rebuilding your community. This has to encompass working hand in hand with all organizations presented and to invite all stakeholders to the table. Take a look at this graph. You may have seen it before. The rule of tens is a very general estimation that can vary greatly upon the type of disaster and the resiliency of the community. However, the rule of tens can give us a starting point to see approximately how long the recovery process may take. Take the number of days that the community is working on rescue, multiply that by 10 to get the rough length of the relief phase. During this phase, everyone is working hard to ensure that survivors are safe, being fed, provide shelter, clothing, and other necessary items. Now multiply that number by another 10 to get a rough estimate of the number of days to recovery. Graphed here are 10 days, 2 days, 7 days of the initial rescue phase. In darker blue, you can see the relief phase, and finally in teal, the estimated time for the recovery. Now, if we apply this rule to the recent Superstorm Sandy, from our sources, recovery lasted roughly 21 days. That brings us to 210 days. Multiplied by another 10 brings us to 2,100 days, which is nearly 6 years until recovery will be completed. Does anyone have questions up to this point that we can answer for you?
Hi, Suzanne. This is Barry. We do have 3 questions, but they're all the same question, and that is, will this presentation be posted? And the answer is yes. We'll post the presentation after all 4 parts have been presented, so that means sometime after tomorrow, probably on Thursday. We'll post the presentation in PowerPoint form, and we'll also make a recording of the presentation available, and let's hope that the recording process works, and we'll rely on the technology to take care of us there. But that will be posted at our website, which is www.cwserp.org. So check it on Thursday, and you should have access to the presentations. And that's the main question at this point.
Thank you, Barry. And the email address will also be posted during the presentation. A common misconception when starting an LTRG is that FEMA will take care of the recovery process after the disaster. No single entity would be able to take on the effects of a disaster alone. It needs the collaboration of many. A long-term recovery group will be the hub of the disaster recovery process, allowing many different entities to work together and collaborate, making sure that resources are placed where they are needed. Now that a disaster has just occurred, how do we know what is best for our community? I briefly touched on the different models of an LTRG. Let's look at this in more detail as you get started developing your group. Here are the 3 types. There are others with a variety of names, as I mentioned earlier. An unmet needs committee, the least structured of the 3, helps faith-based groups and secular agencies coordinate their efforts to avoid duplication of services. A long-term recovery committee is more structured than an unmet needs committee. However, its work includes enhancing communication among agencies in the community and also speaking publicly for the group to generate funding in the form of donations or advocacy. A long-term recovery organization may need to employ management and program staff that are participating in the effort. These employees are paid through donations and/or member agencies. Paying employees in an organization can be controversial. However, it is important to have capable and trustworthy workers. The same applies to have a cadre of capable and trustworthy directors and/or coordinators, financial personnel, and disaster case managers. Because the group will be handling donations, it will be necessary to establish a 401c3 status. You may do so by either getting involved with an existing organization status or by establishing your own. This is done by doing work with an attorney or an accountant. But don't let this discourage you. Donors will want to give to an established organization. If you are attaching to an organization, you may need to negotiate an administrative cost. Usually it is 3 to 5%. If you are asked to pay for 10% or more, that is generally too high. How do you determine what is best for your community? There are several factors that can help you decide. What is the size and scope of the disaster? What type of declaration did the disaster receive? If present resources are not adequate and additional resources will be needed, who will be the big donors in your town? What type of funding is available? Are major nonprofit organizations in the region? Are there major church denominations in your city? Which local and national partners are able to participate? These are all questions that you can ask yourself as you start your LTRG. Gathering accurate and comprehensive information is important. Also, it may seem overwhelming at first. Everything that you gather will be used by the long-term recovery group. The information will come from all active organizations after a disaster. Some of them may be federal, nonprofit, or civic organizations. Keep everything that you come across, as it may be useful throughout your process. We will talk about different sources of information that are available and where to look for them. The first thing that you want to do is a windshield tour. There's no substitute for using your 5 senses in an assessment. Drive around the area and see for yourself what has happened. Get out of the car to get a feel for the area. What do you hear, smell, or see? It may be helpful to buy a map. Seeing the disaster-affected areas in comparison to the surrounding areas can help you to form your LTRG. How will rebuilding the disaster area fit into the surrounding area that was not affected? A city, county, or a state map may help to gain perspective of the area that you are trying to clean up and/or rebuild. Be sure to take photos and video of the area. This is also a great tool for you and the group to understand what has happened, where it has happened, and just how extensive the damage is. Use the resources of people who know their community. Newspapers and other local media are good resources to start with. From the news stories, you can find what organizations are already involved. While you read the newspaper, you should look for members of the interfaith community, local interfaith alliance, and religious institutions. Reach out to civic groups. and any organization that may have something to contribute to the LTR process. Many people will be gathering information, including the local emergency management agency and the federal emergency management agency. You should keep in close contact with these agencies, as they have many resources for the survivors of the community and for your LTRG. They will need your input, and you certainly can use theirs. This also creates opportunity to develop a good relationship with these agencies. The Internet can give you quick results and answer many of your questions. This is a great place to look up information. Here are just a few: Google Alerts, Disaster News Network, CNN, and the Weather Channel. Web searches will give you a larger perspective on the area. Be sure to use only credible sources. Facebook seems to be a great resource as well. It also helps to alleviate misconceptions and misinformation being reported to community members in the process. Also talk to the local authorities, fire chief, police, neighborhood groups, faith leaders, and volunteer agency leadership. Have a discussion with people from every part of the county that was affected on a regular basis, especially those who helped the most. This is a picture from our recent visit with the Ironbound Community Center in Newark, New Jersey. Your church world service point of contact is also a good resource. Your state VOED chairperson or local voluntary organizations active in disaster members are all invaluable sources for information. Finally, there will be community gatherings convened by the mayor, Red Cross, FEMA, county officials, and many others. Sometimes these meetings produce more heat than light, but it can be an important source of information because of who will be there. Some of these meetings will produce a lot of mixed emotions, such as anger, blame, and resentment. However, listen well, there's a lot of information under the surface. You will probably be a little overwhelmed with all the information at first, but this is another piece to help you decide who to help, where the focus of the LTRG needs to be. Find out what you need to know. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Yet, it doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the lives that were affected. What happened? Think about the stages of the disaster that I shared with you in the beginning of this presentation. What happened in each phase? Who was involved? How many homes have been damaged? How severely? Where are the inhabitants? Were they evacuated? What critical infrastructure has been damaged? Were the schools and or hospitals damaged? What was the impact on the business community? For every question you answer, there will be 10 more. Decide what is important. What are the community strengths? How prepared was the community before the disaster? Who is already present in your community? Is recovery starting smoothly? What organizations are already existing? These are questions that will help to determine the capacity of the team that may be already present and what additional resources may be needed. Community capacity can be evaluated and built upon. The best use of all organizations' resources and strengths will largely determine the success of disaster recovery in the long term. What faith communities are present? Not just houses of worship, but faith-based missions, religious social groups, and so forth. Pastors, rabbis, and other faith leaders are definitely a great source to find out who has been affected. What other pre-existing organizations normally serve your community? There may be some that are present that I did not mention. Goodwill Industries or social service agencies such as Adult and Family Services can be a good place to look for people who have been affected. When you look for the most vulnerable population in your community, be sure to also talk to staff from the local homeless shelters, food banks, community clinics, and other places where vulnerable populations may be found. Now that we have gathered information from various sources in town, we must know how to sort it. Based on your own good judgment, you will have to decipher what is most important and work your way down to the least important. Of course, you must validate all your information and seek multiple sources. Throughout this process, you must continue to update it. Keep your updated information readily at hand. It will be useful as the LTRG develops. We also need to be mindful that there will be a number of issues you will be faced with. Be prepared that you will probably encounter limitations and inhibitors that can affect the recovery process. I will be talking about some examples in the next few slides. I will start with limitations and how they can inhibit the recovery process. Some communities might see themselves as too limited. They may not have the resources or people power to get the community running again. This is where you can make use of the information you just gathered. You probably have more than you realize. Take a careful inventory of what you have and who is involved. Depending on how you see it, you can turn existing resources into many. You may feel intimidated at first and do not know where to begin. Know that all the information that you gather from organizations, government agencies, and businesses around the community will help you determine what to do next. A big question that you may be thinking of at this stage will be related to resources. What does it take to recover? What do I need? What will it take to rehabilitate the homes that I just surveyed? I will give you a list of possible resources in our second hour of this presentation today, so please stay tuned. You may have never done this before. The community has never had a disaster before, and you may not want to reach out to people who have experience with working with this type of disaster. A few questions you want to ask yourself is, who works best with damage after, let's say, a hurricane? Who do we go to for consultation? Be assured that there are organizations and individuals willing to help. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Let's look at people you probably already know or have recently met and can be of great help to you. There are, of course, the FEMA VELs, Voluntary Agency Liaisons, faith-based organizations, local leaders, VOED members, and other community organizations. All these entities have the recovery of the whole community in mind and will most likely welcome to be partners in the recovery process. Begin a conversation about these 4 issues with the people in your community. From there, you will identify your strengths and be able to fill the gaps as you proceed. We will now cover some inhibitors that might be present in your community. Unfortunately, inhibitors may be in places that you may not expect. Let's look at some examples. In any disaster, there's always plenty of reason for anger and blame. If it's not dealt with and allowed to fester, it can slow down recovery. Anger and blame are sensitive issues. It may be hard to hear conflicting points of views. There may be a person or agency or organization that will be frowned upon by another group or many. Stressful circumstances for survivors and responders, unfortunately, often result in finger pointing. The long and often slow process to the new normal exaggerates this as well. However, it won't get anyone anywhere if you dwell on it. We need to try and keep ourselves in check to realize that we can accomplish more together than we can alone. This is what it means to work together, not against each other or over someone. Recovery can take longer if we do not work together. Let people vent, listen, stay objective, and move forward. Does anyone know someone that sees disaster as an opportunity to hog the limelight? Is there someone who wants all the credit? Again, working together is key in this process. Also have open, honest dialogue and communication. It is important that all organizations and individuals share the same goals and focus towards achieving these goals. It may sometimes take gentle reminders to refocus the group. The best question to ask this organization is, what does this person or organization provide, and how will he or she help the recovery process? You can then fit this person or organization into the larger long-term recovery picture. Everyone will be part of the process, and no single organization can do it alone or take all the credit for the recovery process. It would be nice if prejudice and discrimination wouldn't exist. In an ideal world, we would be able to work together. But such is not the case. Race, culture, ethnicity, social and economic differences are all excuses for prejudice. While communities often can put aside some of those to pull together in the immediate aftermath of a disaster event, recovery is the time when those begin to reappear. Most communities have big dogs and little dogs. A big dog can be any person or organization that is trying to overpower the recovery process. Some big dogs think that they have to prove that they are big by intimidating the other dogs in the neighborhood. This could be anyone who does not have the goal in mind and only looking out for themselves. Some people or some groups have control issues. There always seems to be that person or group who wants to run the show. One way to overcome this is to hold a town meeting and appoint leaders by unanimous vote. That way, those who think they are in control will hopefully see the greater picture. Outside pressure often works around issues of money. Donors want to determine who gets their money. As recovery moves forward, the donors will want to know where their money went. They will want to know why you haven't spent it yet, or they will want exact accounting of every penny. Donors may even want personal contact with the recipients of the money. Keeping good records will help you report to the LTRG. The LTRG will then organize that information and have it ready when donors ask questions like these. Another set of issues will arise as a result of government and community decisions made during the process. Because the government must do things with a certain legal process in mind, recovery can take a little longer than originally perceived. You might see this process as a delay in recovery. Remember that those whose lives have been disrupted by a disaster are often angry and don't want to wait. Survivors want to get their lives back on track as soon as possible. Communication is the key here among the members of the LTRG, donors, and disaster survivors. There will be many legal processes to keep in mind, and they also have to be explained thoroughly with survivors. It may not minimize their anger, but explaining will show that you care. You may encounter people or organizations doing work on houses that might be condemned or might be part of a future buyout. It's unfortunate and to be avoided if possible, but sometimes work gets done on a home that will not be viable in the long term. This is where good case management will come in. We will talk about this in more detail when we discuss disaster case management. Contractors may fear that volunteers will take paying work. One of many issues to be faced is local contractors and unions resenting volunteer groups because they are losing profits. In many cases, the long-term recovery organizations are very proactive in convening a meeting of union, including unionized and non-union contractors and others, to talk about how the volunteers can work with the contractors to rebuild the community. The volunteers will need the contractors and the construction management team to help guide them as they rebuild the community after a disaster. This is where it will be important to point out that some of the vulnerable population will solely have to rely on volunteer labor, that this is the only way they can get to rebuild their damaged homes. Supplies and material should also be purchased locally, if possible, to support your local businesses. The recovery issues that I just covered were limitations and potential inhibitors within a community. Knowing how this affects a group as a whole, you can start to choose leaders for the group. Good leadership in the LTRG can help address these issues I have just discussed and find solutions. Leaders have presence when they walk into the room, can command attention, and are able to instill a sense of hope. Let's look a little closer at what leader you will need for this task. It is important that he or she understands the recovery vision of the community to be effective and a visionary leader. He or she should be able to convincingly communicate the vision and bring others into recovery leadership roles. A leader will help people see what is possible. A leader is persistent in achieving goals and won't give up. A leader is someone whom the community invests in and trusts. This can be a sensitive issue. Take a look at the candidate's background and work ethic. Will this person be appropriate for the task? Someone who can build consensus and is without bias. A leader needs to know how to delegate, work fairly, and assign tasks to others who are best for the job. You need a candidate who doesn't give up and works energetically and effectively toward the community's goals. He or she is a person who leads by example. As you choose leaders, there are 3 types to keep in mind. You want to be sure to have one of each on your team. A visionary leader. Visionary leaders are those that have a vision of recovery and effectively shares and communicates that vision. An example of a visionary leader would be Martin Luther King Jr. An executive leader is one who will know how to delegate tasks to the group according to the visionary leader's direction. A functional leader is one who will be in the nitty-gritty of daily tasks, working with volunteers and getting dirty with the workers. For example, a leader within a subgroup. These leaders, along with the group, should get together as early as possible to start constructing a unified vision of recovery. Leaders you appoint should be preferably from different backgrounds, skills, and ethnicities. Leaders that you choose should always reflect what the community looks like. Collaborative partners help identify and authorize those leaders. I just shared with you how to start your long-term recovery group. Gather information from various sources in town, verify the information, and keep it handy. From there, you can get a group together and take note of inhibitors that may slow down the recovery process. And finally, I wrapped up with how to best choose your leaders. From visionary to functional leaders, You will need an enthusiastic group of leaders that will know how to instill a sense of hope in your community. Mobilize, energize, effectively communicate, and of course the willingness to guide the group. I would also like to introduce some groups active in the disaster response and long-term recovery. Some of them might be familiar to you and some may not. There are a few bullet points under each with a brief summary of what they do. I know that some of you are very familiar with all of these organizations, but I'm certain that we have some in our audience that have never heard of these groups. Please don't worry about writing all this down. You can get information on all the organizations by visiting our website at www.cwserp.org. In coordination with your state ROAD and FEMA WELL, invite the local regional representatives of these organizations. These organizations might be able to address unmet needs that FEMA may not be able to assist you with. I'll let you look at this for just a little bit. This is a list of our member denominations. With the help of these churches, CWS is able to carry out its mission, and I will have a test on this at the end of the presentation. No, just kidding. Take a look to see if there's a denomination near your area. It is a good idea to become acquainted with the faith-based community to see what they can offer in time of a disaster. Now take a look at the nonprofit organizations listed on the next few slides. Some of them may be organizations you are very familiar with. Others you may not. They all are good resources in their time after a disaster. And here on the bottom you see the website we referred to a couple of times now, cwserp.org. And we're almost at the end of our part 1. And before we take a break, are there any questions?
Let's see.
No additional questions at this point. So we can go ahead and press on to the break. But if you have questions, please enter them now, and we'll cover them right after we come back.
Yes, please ask us your questions. We're here to work with you and to help in any way we can. Okay, we will take a 15-minute break, have some coffee, snack, and we will see you for part 2 in 15 minutes. Thank you.